Good morning, church. I was talking to a friend a couple weeks ago. We were on the phone, and he was telling me a story from his life, and it was a story I'd heard before, and we were talking about some other stories about when he first came to Northwest, which I'll tell you about at the very end of this sermon, about how he got connected here, about people in his life, and at times when he lost a job. And as I'm listening to him tell the story of his life that I'd heard before, I had this moment of being overwhelmed by God's work in his life, and I just blurted out and I said to him, "Brother, you have come a long way." And I loved his response because there wasn't that kind of false humility sometimes when somebody gives us a compliment. He just said, "Thank you." And without missing a beat, he said, "And I thank God for some friends. I thank God for this person and this person and this person and this person and this person." And he's naming name after name of friends that he made when he first came here, friends of Jesus who walked with him, transformed his life, changed his life, catalyzed something really great in his life. And I hope by the end of this sermon today, because last week, remember I said everybody here has a dream, and part of that dream is that God would change your life. And I want to tell you today that the way God changes our lives is not just through a sermon, but through a friend. You know, I was kind of hurt, my feelings were kind of hurt when he was talking about how all these people changed his life, because he didn't mention any sermon that I preached. And he didn't mention any program that we had at our church. He didn't mention any conference he had. He mentioned friends. That's why I want you to turn this morning to the book of Ruth. Okay? If you have a Bible, you can turn there. We'll have the verses on the screens. You know, when you get in your Old Testament, right before some of the bigger books like 1 Kings and 2 Kings and 1 Chronicles and 2 Chronicles, you're going to find the book of Judges, and nestled up next to the book of Judges, you have the book of Ruth. The story about a woman who was actually the wrong race, an immigrant, a woman who really had nothing, and you're going to see how God uses her in an incredible way to transform, to catalyze, to bring change in people's lives. And so just to give context, I'm going to just jump right into verses 1 through 5. You ready? It came about in the days when the judges governed that there was this famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the land of Moab with his wife and his 2 sons, and the name of the man was Elimelech. And the name of his wife was Naomi. The names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem in Judah. Now they entered the land of Moab and remained there. Then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. And they took for themselves Moabite women as wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other was Ruth, and they lived there about 10 years. Then both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and the woman was bereft of her 2 children and her husband. Now, as soon as you enter into this text, you know that we got some problems here. There's this woman named Naomi who married a guy named Elimelech. It's during the time of the Judges. What do you know from the time of the Judges? There's a repeated saying in that book that during that time, everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Boy, we could do a sermon on that today, right? But we're not going to. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And you notice, you read in Bethlehem, do you know what Bethlehem means? House of bread. In the house of bread, there's a famine. We got a problem. And Elimelech does what men did during those days. He did what was right in his own eyes. So he decides to go to Moab. Y'all know anything about Moab? They hated Israel, and Israel hated them. They weren't supposed to hang out with Moabites. He immigrates to Moab to try to eke out an existence. And while they're there, Everything they wish to avoid, poverty and death and famine, comes on them. Elimelech dies. The 2 sons die. And Naomi ends up in incredible poverty, so much so that we find out later in the book that she has to sell her ancestral land back in Israel. When Naomi gets back to Bethlehem, some of the lady friends of hers that she knew growing up greet her, and they say, hey, there's Naomi. Naomi means beautiful. So look at verse 20. When she sees these friends, she says, don't call me Naomi, don't call me beautiful, call me Mara. Mara means bitter. For the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went out full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why do you call me Naomi? Since the Lord has witnessed against me and the Almighty has afflicted me and God is against me. Now, how many have heard that statement before from Naomi? God has been dealt bitterly with me. I want you to know something hit me this week as I was working on this passage, that I realized that even in my own thinking about Naomi, it was easy to go to this place where I could look at Naomi and think, wow, she's just kind of overly dramatic. She's a little on the emotional side, and I guess she's one of those people who see the glass half empty rather than half full. You must understand, Naomi is an old widow. A widow during that time lived on a very, very thin line of survival. She is too old to work. She is too old to get married, to have someone take care of her. Because during that time, let me remind us, you didn't get married for things like pleasure and sex. You got married so that you could have kids to take care of you in your old age and work your field and carry on the family line. She's too old to do that. And she's in a place of incredible poverty because she has to sell her ancestral land. And yet, we're going to get to this, chapter 4, verse 14. There comes a time at the end of this story where she's holding a grandchild. And it says in chapter 4, verse 14, that the women, her friends, they're gathered around again and they say, wow, you're blessed of the Lord. And then in verse 15, there's this little statement. It says, for your daughter-in-law who loves you is better to you than 7 sons. And nobody here goes, whoa, that's crazy. Nobody here has kind of the hair sticking up on the back of your back right now, because we're not used to those kinds of phrases. Sons, you wanted to have a son in a traditional culture to carry on the family name, to work the land. 7's the perfect number. When they say you have a daughter-in-law who loves you better than 7 sons, you know what those women are saying? You have the perfect life. You have, in your story, a fairy tale ending. And she lived happily ever after. That's the idea. So here you have a woman who starts here, bitter. God has been bitter to me. By the time we get to the end of the story, she lived happily ever after. How does she get from there to here? I want to tell you, it is through her daughter-in-law, Ruth. It is through an immigrant woman who is of the wrong race. And today, I just want to encourage you, when you just look at Ruth, I hope you leave here today, and every person here, you know beyond a shadow of a doubt that you matter. And you know beyond a shadow of a doubt whether you're an introvert, an extrovert, whether you think you have great gifts or no gifts, whatever you think when you look in the mirror, like our testimony said this morning, that you know that there is a power in the friendship that you have to offer through Jesus today, and it really, really does matter. So here's what we're going to look at. 3 things. Ruth's Hesed. Ruth's Hesed transforms Naomi's life. Ruth's Hesed catalyzes Hesed in a guy named Boaz's life. And Ruth's Hesed actually touches Ban's life and John's life and Doug's life and Michelle's life and Laura's life. And I use the word Hesed today because Hesed is actually the key word in this book. It shows up 3 times explicitly and 1 time implicitly. Now, we're doing a series here, and I handed out the very first week these little hearts with Hesed engraved on it. And I said that Hesed shows up 250 times in your Old Testament. And what we're doing is we're just taking a few passages in 8 weeks to just look and see what kind of light that shines on this word that can't be translated by one English word. That's why even when I pray, you hear me saying things like benevolence and goodness and kindness and loyalty and faithfulness, okay? What is shocking about this particular book and where Hesed shows up, of the 250 times this word shows up in your Bible, the overwhelming majority of those times it is talking about God and God alone. And you get this sense that God alone is Hesed. In fact, in the book of Proverbs, we are told this. Many a person will say, I will be a Hesed friend to you. But somebody you can really trust to live that out when your life is not going well, when your marriage is struggling, when the chips are down, few people will actually live that out. And now we have a book where this word Hesed is not just talking about God, but it's talking about a person who is a friend named Ruth. So let's look at this. Ruth, her Hesed transforms Naomi's life, catalyzes Hesed and Boaz's life, and it touches our lives. Let's start here in verse 8, back to chapter 1. You get this sense that one day Naomi gets out of her chair and says, I'm going back to Bethlehem. And she takes her first steps, and there's 2 daughter-in-laws, Moabite women with her, Orpah and Ruth. And you know, this Orpah doesn't get much press, but Orpah is actually not a bad woman. Naomi actually says the same thing to her as she says to Naomi. Look at verse 8. And Naomi said to her 2 daughter-in-laws, go return each of you to her mother's house, and may the Lord deal Hesed with you as you have dealt, implied, Hesed with me. And not just with me, as you've dealt with the dead and with me. Yo, I told you that I've been working through these passages with a couple rabbis, and the rabbis told me this, Neil, that the greatest example of Hesed that a human being can show to another human being is by caring for the dead. They get it from this passage. They said because the dead can't do anything, right? It's showing love when a person doesn't earn it, that you don't owe it to them, and they can't pay you back, right? And when Naomi says this, you've shown it to the dead, and with me, they've shown it to Elimelech and those sons by caring for Naomi. Naomi looks at those 2 daughter-in-laws and says, what does she say? Go return each of you to her mother's house. Don't hang out with me here. I have nothing to offer you. In fact, if stay in your land, because if you stay in your land, at least you have some people you know, right? At least you have a mother and a father, and at least you have some people who will take care of you. At least you have the opportunity maybe to get married again. And we know the story goes that Ruth clings to her mother-in-law. And she says in verse 16, do not urge me to leave you or turn back from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. How many here, raise your hand if you've heard that verse before. Raise your hand. Okay, almost everybody here. Even if you haven't been to church in a while, you've heard that because you've heard it where? At a wedding, right. When 2 people are getting married. But there's another verse here, y'all, that is the very next thing that Ruth says. And it's not something that you kind of want to say at a wedding. You don't want to talk too much about death at a wedding. There's actually something I say at a wedding, y'all, that sometimes the brides have gotten wind that I might say this. I say, husbands, you're to love your wives even when it feels like death. And I've actually had some brides come to me and say, my mom couldn't handle that. Please don't say that, okay? Verse 17. Ruth says, where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Thus may the Lord do to me and worse, if anything but death parts you and me. Here's why I say Ruth Hesed transforms Naomi's life. What is Ruth expecting she's going to find in Bethlehem? Think about this. Church, we've had a lot of connections and experience with immigrants and refugees lately. A lot of you have. And if you've been having those conversations, you know that every immigrant, every refugee comes here expecting what? What do you think? What are they expecting? What? Freedom. A better life. That's right, Michelle. Something better, a better life. I was talking to an Afghan refugee not long ago. We're sitting in his apartment having tea, and he's telling me all these great dreams he has of a better life here. It was beautiful. He's telling me them, but then he starts telling them in a way that you could see his timeline was really, really short. And I forgot that he actually has done a lot of translating for the military and really understands American culture, and he caught a look on my face that I didn't even know I was putting out. And it was a look of skepticism and doubt about his timeline. And he looks at me. I didn't even say a word. He says, hey, this is the land of opportunity, right? And it's like he caught me. And I said, yes, it is. Every immigrant, every refugee comes here expecting a better life. And you know what Ruth says about her immigration to Bethlehem? Where you die, I'm going to die. She knows. She knows she's going to a place with no contacts, no connections, with a woman who's poor, doesn't even have a land. A friend that transforms people's lives simply does this. They're willing to give their whole life so the other person can have a life. It's that easy, okay? So I ask you, do you have a friend like that? Or are you a friend like that? Church, I am begging you to listen to this right now. You want to be a church. We have a dream here to be a church where we end up having conversations about Jesus, and those conversations go to a place where people's lives are really transformed. You become a friend like Ruth. I want to give up my life so that you have a chance for life. You know, it's so fascinating when I heard my friend talking about all these people, and by the way, all these people were single people who at the time were just giving their lives up for Jesus. If you're a single person here today, I just want to say, God wants to do something unique through you. And he names all these people, and this week I did something I wasn't even expecting to do it. I was making this list of high points in my life and low points in my life, holy moments and hard times, times when I bought a house, went on a mission trip, 25 years being here, living out a dream of riding my bike across the country and having conversations about Jesus. And I'm listing this thing, and by it, there's just names of friends that I realized none of these things would have happened in my life apart from friends of Jesus who came alongside me, and they were transformational in my life. I want to ask you, do you have a friend like that? Are you a friend like that? Remember, Remember what Jesus said to his disciples when he only had a short amount of time left with them. Last Supper, last words are lasting words. And in John 15, Jesus said to his disciples, "This is my suggestion for you." This is my commandment. To you guys who I'm expecting is going to go turn the world upside down, you're going to transform the world, that you love one another just as I have loved you, and greater love has no one than this, that one day lay down their life for their friends. And that is what Ruth did, and that is why Ruth Hesed transforms Naomi's life from the beginning of this story to the end of it. Got it? Now, the second statement here I said I would look at is Ruth Hesed catalyzes Hesed in a guy named Boaz's life, this guy that she will ultimately marry. Go to chapter 2. Now, you got to try to imagine they're back in Bethlehem. I don't know where they're living. I don't know if they're in a shelter, if they're homeless, if they're in a tent. But I imagine Ruth and Naomi sitting around hungry, wondering where their next meal is going to come from. That's the reality of the situation. And we read in chapter 2, verse 2, that Ruth the Moabitess, come back to that. Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, "Please let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain." Verse 3, she departed and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and she happened to come to the portion of the field belonging to Boaz, who was the family of Elimelech. Let me go glean in the field. Now, here's what's going on. There's a lot of history here. Landowners had fields. They would not glean the edges of their field. Their edges of their field were to be left for the poor, because God's Hesed is always looking after and caring for the poor. That if you were a landowner, you weren't allowed to absolutely make every single penny you could. And so, we're told Ruth was a Moabitess. It says it several times because obviously the person who wrote this book doesn't want you to forget she's an immigrant, she's of the wrong race. She's a Moabitess. By volunteering to go and say, "I'll go glean in the field," she was putting her life at risk, y'all. It's really clear that this isn't a safe thing for a single woman to do who's of the wrong race. So much so that when Boaz, this man who owns the field, this man of great standing in his community, he actually sees her. And it says in verse 8, Boaz said to Ruth, "Listen carefully, my daughter, do not go to glean in another field. Furthermore, don't go on from this one. Stay right here with my maids." That would have been the servant women who were actually on his payroll, that were a part of this harvesting process. "Let your eyes be on the field which they reap. Go after them. Indeed, I have commanded the servants not to touch you." You see it? "And when you're thirsty, go to the water jars and drink from what the servants draws." See, Boaz knows that this woman could have been hurt, abused, maybe even raped. And he says, "I'm going to take care of you. It's dangerous for you, a Moabite, a wicked, horrible person." That's how a Moabite would have been seen. Later, he makes sure she is fed. She is astounded by the grace that Boaz shows her. And it says in verse 10 that she falls on her face, bowing to the ground, and says to him, "Why have I found favor in your sight that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?" You think they're trying to make a big deal of this? And you know what Boaz says? He's got a list of all she has done. Essentially, Boaz says this: "I have seen your Hesed in action." It hasn't just been words. I have seen your Hesed in action. And that night, I want you to try to imagine this. Ruth is coming home, not with just a little handful of grain to try to make some little loaf of bread or piece of bread. She comes home with all of this grain. She comes to Naomi, who's sitting there hungry. I can imagine Naomi's eyes get about this big, and she says, "What the heck happened?" And she tells her about Boaz and all that he's done. And in verse 20, watch it here. Naomi says to her daughter-in-law, "May this man be blessed of the Lord." Now she's going to say something about the Lord. Remember, she said he's bitter. He's taken everything from me. "May he be blessed of the Lord, who has not withdrawn his Hesed to the living and to the dead." Oh, God hasn't given up on us after all. He has not withdrawn his Hesed from Elimelech and his sons and me. You can see Naomi's heart transforming right in the middle of the story. Why? Because Ruth's Hesed transforms Naomi's life. You can see Naomi's heart warming up. Again, being able to hold on, like we talked about last week, hold on to Hesed, to be able to hold on once again to this thing that is repeated about God over and over again. And then it says in verse 20, and Naomi said something else to her. By the way, this man is our relative. He is one of our kinsmen redeemers. He's a Goel. This is huge. Again, we don't go, "Oh goodness, what's up here?" And I'll just remind you, a kinsman redeemer was a very specific person talked about in the law of God. Let's go back here. When Israel was taking the land, God divided up the land in 12 sections for the 12 tribes of Israel. He divides up the land. Actually, the Levites didn't get a part of the land, so let me say 11. And those pieces of land that he divides up, each tribe divided that up among their families, okay? He divides it up among their families, and it was God's intention that when your family got a piece of land, it was with you for generation after generation after generation, because God was creating, the Bible says, a kingdom, a royal priesthood. His people were royalty. They were to live like kings and queens. And so God didn't want them to lose their land. And so he made these provisions just in case times got really hard. He made some provisions so that ultimately you didn't have these people that had everything and people who didn't have anything. And so he said this, two things. One, every 50 years, if you've lost your land, it goes back. Year of Jubilee. The other provision he made was this thing called a kinsman redeemer. That if there was somebody in your family line saw that you lost your land, even before the 50 years, they could buy it back for you. Now, just to understand what Boaz does here, I want to say three things about Boaz. For him to buy back that land, it would have cost him financially, right? He would have had to take it on whatever debt there was. I imagine it was a lot. The second thing that is really hard for our modern ears is he would have had to marry Ruth the Moabitess. You see, there was a provision in the law called levirate marriage, where you could marry the widow of somebody in your family line and bring up descendants through them. He would have had to marry her. To really get the land back and permanent, he would have had to marry Ruth the Moabitess, have family through hers, and it wouldn't be his family. It would ultimately be Elimelech and his son. Anybody here willing to do that? And lastly, he would have had to marry Ruth the Moabitess. I want to remind you from Deuteronomy chapter 23, just since we've mentioned this word Moabite so much, God spoke to Moses and gave this direction: no Ammonite or Moabite shall enter the assembly of the Lord. None of their descendants, even to the 10th generation, shall ever enter the assembly of the Lord. Y'all, I was talking to these rabbis about this. And you know, in Jewish circles, there's lots of scholarly discussion and debate with how can Boaz rightly marry Ruth. It is such an extreme act when God said they shall never enter the assembly, and they've got all kind of reasons why they've worked out. I just want you to hear, do you see what Boaz has done? He's taken on the debt. He said, I'm going to be willing to have children through her, not my own, and I'm going to marry a Moabitess. And that's why I say, Ruth's Hesed catalyzes Hesed in Boaz's life. So Ruth and Naomi, they make this plan and they decide they're going to put all their eggs in this basket. And we know that Ruth goes to the threshing floor at night. The threshing floor was where they took the wheat and would cause the grain to separate from the stalks. And he's basically sleeping at his work during the harvest season. She comes up, uncovers his feet, snuggles up to his feet, covers himself up, and we're told in chapter 3, verse 8. 3, verse 8. Here's where I'm at in the story now. I want you to see it. It happened in the middle of the night that the man was startled and bent forward, and behold, look what happens next. A woman was lying at his feet. And he says, who are you? And she answered, I am Ruth, your maid. So spread your garment over your servant, for you are a close relative. You are a Goel. You are a kinsman redeemer. Spread your garment over your servant. And it was just a way of saying this: marry me. Take me as your wife. Take care of me and take care of my people. And in verse 10, I want you to see it here. Boaz says, may you be blessed to the Lord, my daughter. You have shown your last, there's the word, Hesed, greater than your first. Your first Hesed, coming back with your mother-in-law, putting everything in your life on the line, and now saying you're willing to marry me. This is why I say, Ruth's Hesed catalyzes Hesed in Boaz's life. He actually looks and says, I'll do whatever you ask. I'll take on the debt. I will marry you, and everything, all my wealth goes into your family. Whoa. Ruth's Hesed catalyzes Hesed in Boaz's life. And I want you to hear, this can happen to you and through you. You know what's interesting about my friend? This friend is one of the most generous people I know, has lots of friends. Lots of friends that he is showing Hesed to. And here's what often happens to us. I'll call him and say, hey, do you want to go to lunch? And you know what he says to me? More times than not, I'm sorry, I already have lunch with a friend. And you know what I say to him? Oh yeah, you having lunch with a friend? Is it a secret? Can you not tell me who it is? And then he'll tell me who it is, and I'll be jealous. It started with somebody, actually a group of people who showed him Hesed. And now, that Hesed catalyzed in his heart, he is showing Hesed. I don't even know if those people know how God used them to transform somebody's life. And it wasn't a sermon. Y'all think about this. Boaz is incredibly generous, kind, loving, benevolent, Hesed, and it wasn't because there's no mention that Boaz heard any sermons here. There's no mention that Boaz went to the synagogue one day and kind of found out some things about how to grow and be a better friend. He watched how Naomi, he heard the stories of how Naomi was loved on by Ruth. It's why I believe every person here, you can be a part of the transformational work of God in another person's life. So I could end the sermon here and say, okay, go work hard to be good friends to everybody now, okay? And you're thinking, oh, you said it was so simple, just give my life to another. That sounds kind of hard, doesn't it? And that's why I'm really glad I have a third point this morning for you to hear this. Ruth's Hesed touches your life today. It really does. Go to chapter 4, verse 14. Let's look at they lived happily ever after one more time. Verse 14, okay, y'all, I want you to think about it. Here's Naomi. Naomi is holding a little baby boy. Ruth and Boaz get married. They have a baby boy. Now, all the grandmas are gathered around, right, grandmothers? They're gathered around. She's holding her little grandson. And the women come in and say, blessed is the Lord, praise God. This is crazy awesome. The Lord has not left you without a redeemer today. And they're not talking about Boaz. And they're not talking about Ruth. It's clear all the attention is on the baby boy whose name is Obed. The Lord has not left you without a redeemer today. The Lord has not left you without somebody to care for you. And this baby boy's name will become great in Israel. May this baby boy be a redeemer and a restorer of life. May this baby boy be a sustainer of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you is better to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him. Verse 17, and the neighbor women gave him a name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi. And they named him Obed, and he is the father. Obed, that baby boy, is the father of Jesse and the father of the great King David. And it's really, really clear that when they wrote this story, they were looking at that baby boy, and the author is wanting you to see a greater redeemer, a greater restorer of life, a greater friend, and his name is David, who is a great, great, great grandson of David himself. I think I said that wrong. It's Jesus, who is a great, great grandson of David himself. And I want you to think about this, Jesus. He's actually a lot like his parents, Ruth and Boaz, but he's even better than them. He's a lot like them, but he's better. He left his home. Ruth left her home. He spent all his wealth on you to make you his friend. Boaz spent his wealth to marry Ruth. But I'm telling you, he's better than them, because when Jesus comes in, never again will you say, in Bethlehem, the house of bread, there's a famine. Because here's what Jesus does, and here's why it's possible for us to show Hesed. Jesus says this, I'm the bread of life. He who comes to me will never hunger, right? Fill yourself with his friendship. Jesus says, everyone who believes in me, out of him will flow rivers of living water. Fill yourself with his friendship. And out of that, I say, go be a friend. Today, go be a friend. Let me finish the story, y'all. In your pew, there's a little pack of lifesavers here. I want to just grab those, because I want you to hold these here. So my friend, I want to tell you how he got to Northwest Bible Church. It was a broken relationship, a broken friendship. In fact, it was a broken engagement. Went in a little bit of a downward spiral, decided I needed to come to a church, okay? He goes to some other church. He says, Neil, I'm not trying to criticize other churches. Nobody reached out and was a friend. Nobody said hello. He comes here. We're meeting over where the high schoolers meet now. Jim Rose was the pastor, great pastor here. Jim Rose was about to preach, and there's a mom, 2 children, and a dad. They're sitting in the row in front of him. The mom pulls out a pack of lifesavers, and she hands them to her kids. Now, I want y'all to think about this. Mom with 2 kids, as the pastor's getting ready to preach, I got an idea she's got a lot on her mind. But somehow, she has the wherewithal to be able to not just care for her friends around her. Y'all, we got to quit just caring for our friends around us that we already know. And I'm not telling you just to buck it up. I'm telling you that we need to be filled with the friendship of Jesus, the Hesed of Jesus. She turns around and she says, would you like this pack of lifesavers? And here's what my friend thinks. if somebody at this church can be friendly enough to hand me a pack of Lifesavers, maybe there's some people here that I could be friends with. Maybe there's some life-saving going on at this church. And that was the beginning of the transformation of his life. Do you believe me when I say there is not a person here that God cannot use to be a transformational friend, a catalytic force in the name of Jesus in another person's life? Amen? Let's stand together.